Hello and welcome to Spectator TV and the second instalment of our weekly omnibus. I'm John Connolly, the Spectator's news editor. First, coming up this week, Nicola Sturgeon announced that she is separating from her husband, Peter Murrell, the former chief executive of the SNP. On the show to discuss their separation, we have our Spectator's editor, Michael Gove, our data editor, Michael Simmons, and our political editor, Katy. They'll discuss the separation and the future of Scottish politics.
Today we're going to be talking about the news that Nicola Sturgeon has announced that she is officially separating and ending her marriage to Peter Murrell, who held a senior role within the SNP. Michael Gove, to begin with you, were you surprised to hear this news? Posted on Instagram by the former First Minister.
I don't think many people would be surprised. I think it was an open secret that Peter Murrell and Nicola Sturgeon were no longer living as a couple, that she had left what had been their family home. Obviously, this follows in the wake of the police investigation into the SNP's finances, Operation Branch Form, which resulted in Peter Murrell being arrested. And I think it's also the case that Nicola Sturgeon made it clear at the time that she stood down, which was before the police investigation began, that she wanted to move on with a new phase in her life. So obviously, it's a sadness whenever any marriage ends, but in this sense, it's probably the public setting of a seal on what was a widely accepted separation between the two.
And of course, the backdrop to this is Operation Branch Form and the fact that I think over £1.8 million now spent on that investigation in Scotland into potential SNP fraud, over £600,000 of donations. And Nicola Sturgeon's husband, soon to not be husband, he has actually been charged. Nicola Sturgeon was arrested, but then let go. What do we expect to happen here? Do you think this is going to pick up pace, Michael?
Well, the troubling thing, about the police investigation that's now sat with the Crown Office to decide, what happened next, is basically that nobody really understands why it's been going on for so long. The investigation's into its fourth year. All we've had is the charge of Peter Murrell, but that was 9 months ago. And in the last few weeks, two of Scotland's leading KCs have actually made the point that it may reach this time frame where it's gone on so long that Peter Murrell will actually have a human rights defence to say that he's been denied a fair trial because of how long this has been going on for. And legal, obviously it's difficult because you can't really comment much on this live police investigation, but legal commentators who can say the odd thing don't really understand what's going on and why it's taking so long.
And Michael, is this adding to SNP woes? Because, of course, the general election result was tricky. In a way, the party has moved past Nicola Sturgeon, but not so much. It's not really a change of the guard in terms of who has taken over. But yet, their fortunes are looking up a little bit at the moment, thanks to Labour problems.
Yes, you're right. So the SNP had not quite an nadir, but certainly a very bad general election, reduced to more or less single-figure number of MPs in Westminster. But it remains in power in Scotland, remains in power in Holyrood. And you're right, the age of giants, as it were, Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, has ended with Alex Salmond's untimely demise in North Macedonia and Nicola Sturgeon, of course, demitting office as First Minister. So we now have a team at the top of the SNP who are seeking to ensure that we have they have an approach, John Swinney and Kate Forbes, which is lower key, and against the backdrop of a Labour government that is facing real difficulties. The SNP's woes seem to pale, I think, slightly in the minds of Scots in comparison. I don't think that anyone could say that the SNP's time in government has been a roaring success, but certainly for Scots who voted for Labour in the general election in order to ensure that a majority of Scottish MPs are now Labour MPs, those voters who put their faith in Keir Starmer seem now to be repenting of that, and that could mean, admittedly, there's still 15 or so months to go before the next Scottish elections start in earnest. It does seem to be the case that the SNP have a potentially new lease of life in office.
And on that, Michael, I suppose Anna Sawa, I think, really hoped to be Labour First Minister,
yes.
And that's looking harder, and we're seeing him distance himself more. It's not obviously completely unusual for Scottish Labour to take different lines than the main government, but there must be some strain there and frustration.
Absolutely. So Anna Sawa is undoubtedly a highly effective, charismatic and successful Labour leader, but he's herpled, to use a Scots word, by the fact that policies that Keir Starmer has had to put in place in order to seek to balance the budget, maintaining the two-child benefit cap, introducing winter fuel payments. These are policies that the SNP government have said that they oppose, and Anna Sarwar has had to adjust his own position to be closer to the SNP on these issues than to Labour in Westminster. He thinks it's necessary for his electoral survival, but of course the SNP can say, well, we're the ones who are setting the pace, we're the ones who are the genuine Social Democrats here. Scottish Labour is merely a branch of the UK party, and you can't really trust them if they're in office to reflect Scotland's wishes.
And yet, Michael Simmons, there's plenty of SNP dirty laundry at the moment. Of course, we've had the passing of Alex Salmond, and his widow has made a rare intervention, which involves Nicola Sturgeon, it seems.
Yep, so this has come about because the Salmond sort of Sturgeon psychodrama has not died with Mr. Salmond. And we've seen just before, in the run-up to his death, Alex Salmond was continuing a court case against the Scottish Government, which friends of his say was an effort to finally clear his name, as he would see it. And since his death, friends of Salmond have said they are going to continue that case. And I think in an attempt to shut that down, Nicola Sturgeon made an intervention at the weekend through a lunch with the FT interview, where she restated, some of the accusations against Salmond, saying that he could be difficult to work with. And John Swinney then repeated that in an interview. And so, as you say, Moira Salmond, who's in her late 80s, has made what I think might be her first ever public intervention, basically to say the hurt caused to her family and could Alex be left to rest in peace. And I think this shows that this drama is not going to go away anytime soon. I also think it's worth pointing out that it's slightly strange for Nicola Sturgeon and John Swinney to, say all these things about how they knew about how Alex Salmond behaved back in the day when he resigned in 2014. They were both reportedly begging him not to. So I think, some things still don't add up, and it's not clear if we'll ever get to the truth of who knew what.
Do you think the ghost of Alex Salmond and the ongoing scandal, despite the fact he is gone, Michael, could still scupper SNP, progress in the future? Or does the economy trump, a soap opera slagging match?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that Salmond and Sturgeon were the dominant figures who together piloted the SNP to electoral dominance in Scotland and coming within a few percentage points of securing Scottish independence in that 2014 referendum. And next to them, impressive in their own way, as John Swinney and Kate Forbes are, they don't seem to have quite the lustre and glamour that pair did. But that pair, as Michael has quite rightly pointed out, were involved in a tempestuous psychodrama, which led to Alex Salmond facing criminal charges of sexual abuse. Of course, he was acquitted, but the falling out between Salmondites and Sturgeonites still afflicts the broader independence movement and the SNP to this day. And so it will be Swinney and Forbes's, fervent hope that either Operation Branchform doesn't go anywhere, or that it concludes quickly, that the doings of the past are forgotten, and that at the next election, Scots are focusing on bread and butter issues rather than the legacy of this drama. It has to be said, however, of course, that we don't know what the political landscape across the whole UK and in Scotland will look like by the time of the next election to Holyrood. One, I hesitate to say joker in the pack, but one factor that wasn't there in the past is, of course, reform. Proportional representation contributes to the makeup of the Scottish Parliament, and PR, of course, is a tool that Nigel Farage used in the European Parliament, wants to use in the Welsh Assembly, the Senedd elections, and the indication is that Reform are polling just above 10% in Scotland, and so therefore would definitely be represented in what would be a more diverse Scottish Parliament than ever before.
And I think just on that, Michael, I suppose when you think about the nationalist movement, tartan Tories, then I think under Nicola Sturgeon it was much more leaning into this progressive sense, if you think about some of the agenda she was pushing, of course.
On gender.
Exactly. Do you think that the reform angle is going to pick up some SNP supporters when it comes to that fracture?
Well, one interesting factor in the Brexit referendum was that a significant proportion of those who voted to leave the European Union were people who had also voted for the SNP in the past. And even though the SNP sold itself as the most pro-European party in Scotland, arguably the most pro-European party in the United Kingdom, there are a significant section of its support that were opposed to our membership of the European Union, particularly for reasons relating to the common fisheries policy, but not only that. And there is an indication that the reform support may well be from people who were perfectly happy with the idea of independence, but also are culturally very much on the right, obviously. And it's always been the case that the SNP has, notwithstanding the social democratic tone of its leadership, had a number of supporters who would be culturally on the right as well. So, the SNP, like Labour, when it comes to the Red Wall, has to be conscious that there are a section of its voters who could go elsewhere.
And just finally, Michael Simmons, not to put you on the spot, but you are manning our data hub. So looking at the various data that you go through there, what do you think is going to happen in 2026?
Yeah, on current trends, I will stick my neck out and say I think that the SNP will retain power because, we have seen this revival of Scottish Labour that, for the reasons Michael set out, towards the end of last year seems to have kind of dipped away. And I think if Anna Sarwar has not been able to cement that and let the SNP sort of retain a lead, it seems like as long as the constitutional question rumbles on, which looks like it will rumble on indefinitely, that just the electoral maths mean, to me anyway, that the SNP will be the largest party in Scotland, in Holyrood, for a long time to come.
And I suspect that Michael is right. I mean, he's been closer to the data. But I think what we're probably likely to have is, again, a fractured parliament with the SNP not securing a majority of seats, but with their allies from the Greens probably able to continue to govern. And it may well be the case that even if the SNP and the Greens together don't have a majority, that if you had Labour, Liberal Democrat, Conservative and Reform, and the Conservatives are doing better under their new leader, Russell Finlay, than they were just before the election, even then that would be such an unwieldy coalition that one would have to bet that it's probably going to be a Swinney Forms administration after the election.
And the SNP Green partnership didn't end quite as they wanted last time, of course. Thank you, Michael. And thank you for watching.
This week, Israel and Hamas managed to reach a ceasefire. What does this mean for the region and for the wider Middle East? Ben Lazarus joins Jake Wallis-Simons, the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, and Spectator contributor and writer Paul Wood.
So with the ceasefire deal imminent, I understand it's going to be in 3 stages. Jake, perhaps you could outline what those 3 stages might be.
Sure. Well, phase 1 will involve Israel beginning its withdrawal from the main population centres in Gaza and allowing the Palestinians who are directed towards the south for their own safety to begin to return to the north of Gaza. There'll be a surge in aid as well, with 600 aid trucks promised a day. And in return, there'll be 33 hostages released. And the belief is that most, if not all of them, will be alive. And these will be women, children, the elderly, and the wounded. And it's thought to include 5 female soldiers. And we believe Emily Damari, the British hostage, the Spurs fan, 28-year-old Spurs fan, is likely to be released as well. And of course, without forgetting the prisoners who are going to be released, the Palestinian prisoners. We haven't got a number on that yet, but it's likely to be about 50 per female soldier, including about 30 who are doing life sentences. These are all convicted murderers and terrorists that are due to be released, some of which are, we think, going to be exiled to Qatar or Turkey, but most of them will go back to Gaza. Phase 2, after this 6-week period, will be that Hamas releases the remaining living captives, which will mainly be male soldiers, in exchange for a complete withdrawal from Gaza, and some more prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, released as well. And phase 3 is likely to be the bodies of dead hostages being returned in exchange for a 3 to 5 year international reconstruction plan for Gaza.
And Paul, what do you think that reconstruction plan might look like?
Well, we've had precious little detail on that. I think the fundamental and most important point here is that parts of Gaza, most of Gaza, may have been reduced to rubble, but it's rubble, at least in the south, that Hamas will still control. By some historical coincidence, we had the death of Jimmy Carter, President Carter, at the age of 100, a few days ago. And his press secretary was speaking in his obit saying that for each one of the 444 days that the American hostages were held in Tehran, President Carter worked on the hostage crisis, often to the exclusion of everything else. And I thought That's a bit of a contrast with Benjamin Netanyahu. He may certainly care about the hostages, but he did not allow the hostages to deflect his policy. The policy being to not just to cripple Hamas, but in the words that he used at the beginning of the conflict, to destroy Hamas completely. Now, you can call that statesmanship. You can call it something else. Certainly some of the hostage families thought it was the act of a weak leader who needed a war to stay in power. But for all this time, since the October the 7th massacres more than a year ago, Israel has pursued its war aims while attempting to negotiate with Hamas, while at the same time trying to destroy it. This apparently was the same deal on the table in May. So what's changed? Has Netanyahu achieved his war aims? I don't think so. I think this is down to the Trump effect and Trump sending his special envoy, not just to threaten Hamas, but I think to threaten Netanyahu. We don't know all the details, but I think these are the questions we need to be asking now about how the deal was done and what's the small print in it. Does it allow Israel to go back into Gaza? I suspect it does.
And just on the theme of Trump, how do you see a Trump presidency affecting the Middle East, Jake?
Well, Trump is nothing if not unpredictable, of course. But as Paul was saying, his threats to open the gates of hell on Hamas if the hostages were still there once he comes into office on Monday certainly had a profound effect on galvanizing both sides to come to this deal before he takes office. The other element which is relevant to this, I think, is the internal Israeli politics. Over the last year and a bit, there's been a sense or a suspicion, particularly amongst the left, that Benjamin Netanyahu has been prolonging the war, refusing to do a deal, because if he were to accept a deal, then the far-right members of his coalition would bolt the coalition, collapsing his government. So they were holding his feet over the fire, if you like. Well, in September, he introduced another coalition member, Gideon Saar from the New Hope Party, which diluted the far-right's influence enough to allow him to do this deal without them having the whip hand over him. So there's that as well. But I think overall, in the bigger picture, there are a lot of people in Israel who are hopeful about a Trump administration, the effect it will have on the Middle East, because, we saw that interview that Antony Blinken, the American Secretary of State, gave to the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, in which he admitted that Hamas were emboldened and rejected deals when there was a perception of daylight between America and Israel. And that daylight didn't come from nowhere. It came from the rhetoric of President Biden, who made public his hostility towards Israel at certain key points in the negotiations and ended up at some points criticizing Israel more than he criticized Hamas. And that allowed Hamas to think, well, if that alliance is fraying against us, then we've got the potential to play hardball. I don't think we'll see that with Trump as much. He's famously volatile. He will lash out perhaps at Netanyahu sometimes, but we hope or we expect that it's likely, I'm choosing my words carefully with Trump, that he'll be more likely to be shoulder to shoulder with his allies in the Middle East and take a more aggressive stance against the jihadis who threaten them.
As ever with Trump, it could go either way. He is above all a deal maker. Maybe he wants to do a deal in the Middle East, which would involve a Saudi-Israeli rapprochement. Maybe that's a Nobel Prize for Trump, who knows? But the Saudis want a Palestinian state. To have that Palestinian state, you need to get Israeli settlers out of the West Bank. Trump, who calls himself Israel's greatest defender, would be at loggerheads with most Israeli governments and certainly a Netanyahu government if that was the deal on the table. On the other hand, he's appointed a new ambassador to Israel who's famously supportive of settlements in the West Bank. And before we even get to that, I suspect a crisis of some kind will happen with Iran. Iran now has lost Hezbollah, which was what everybody called its strategic deterrent. What's it going to use instead? Well, perhaps this will be the dash to the nuclear weapon that the Iranians are often accused of making. Israel won't stand for that, and maybe in Trump they'll find an Israeli president who will allow them to bomb the nuclear sites, the oil installations, and things like that. So I think we're going to be in for a wild ride, a very unexpected time in the Middle East. It's not necessarily peace, I'm afraid, now that this Gaza hostage deal seems to have been done.
Paul, just on the Iranians, how do you see their perspective changing with the Trump administration? In recent weeks, it seems like their rhetoric has cooled down somewhat from where it was at 6 months ago, but you think they may sort of up gears again later on this year?
Well, don't forget it was President Trump who pulled out of the nuclear deal. He thought it was a sham, and people around him thought it was a sham, and funded Iranian efforts to create proxies around the region, Hamas and Hezbollah. Will we get another deal? Very unlikely. And the question is, how will the US and Israel stop what they believe is an Iranian nuclear program, which is very, very close to getting a working weapon? Israel, I think, will be emboldened. All the gambles that Mr. Netanyahu made, attacking Hezbollah, for instance, have paid off. We may even see a joint US-Israeli attack on Iran. The Iranians seem cowed for the moment. The rhetoric is as tough as ever. And let's not forget, they've twice carried out a direct attack on Israel, something that's never happened before. But I think they are cowed for the moment and realizing this is a very, very dangerous moment for them. And not least because, as Jake was saying, Trump's mercurial. You never know what he's going to do next. And of course, he uses that. That's part of his negotiating strategy, threatening Hamas with hell, threatening privately, Lord knows what, to Netanyahu. And that seems to be what's moved this process on. You often, with Trump, have to look at what he's saying and then expect him to do literally the opposite. It's a negotiating tactic.
I think it's important to recognise how weakened the Iranian regime is by comparison to this time last year. We've seen Hezbollah almost completely or largely destroyed. We've seen Hamas largely destroyed. We've seen Assad falling. And of course, the Iranian air defences were taken out by Israeli missiles in October last year, leaving them very, very vulnerable indeed. And as we know, Russia is busy elsewhere. So Iran has never been less vulnerable, or at least not in modern times. And all it's got left really is its nuclear program. And it understands that it's vulnerable to Israeli and perhaps American bombs on that score as well. So I think that the big loser of last year in the region certainly was the Ayatollah. But in terms of the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu, it's been volatile. I mean, we're learning about Trump and about Musk, indeed, that they can turn on their allies on a sixpence, as we saw with Musk insulting Farage just a couple of weeks after welcoming him in America. And Trump did a similar thing with Netanyahu. They were bosom buddies when Trump was in his first term. In fact, in Israel, northern Israel, there's even a village named after Trump. That's how close they were. But then when Bibi, as he's nicknamed, congratulated Joe Biden on his election win, Trump turned on Netanyahu. So, but they've since sort of made up. So you never really quite know what the interpersonal relationships are going to be like between these huge egos, these big beasts of the world stage. But certainly it seems more likely than not that the Trump agenda in the Middle East will align more closely with the Netanyahu agenda than Biden's did. And as Paul alluded to, the Abraham Accords, there's a big seat at the table open there, waiting for the Saudis to join. I'm less convinced than Paul about how much a Palestinian state could prove a sticking point for the Saudis. They might find a way around that, of watering that down and joining anyway, but time will tell. But certainly between the two of them, Trump and Netanyahu, I think we'll see friction, ups and downs, but ultimately they're more aligned than Biden and Bibi were.
And in terms of Netanyahu back home in a sort of domestic standing, how vulnerable is he going to be once the ceasefire deal is completed? He's been a wartime prime minister, but his coalition could now be shaky, or do you see him sort of staying for the long haul now?
Well, I mean, there are elections coming up, of course, next year, I believe. So he hasn't got that much longer before he has to face the public again, inevitably. I think that he's obviously dealing with the corruption trial, which was suspended recently to allow him to have prostate surgery. So there's that that's going to be reprised as well. His coalition is slightly stronger because the far-right members, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, no longer quite have the same level of veto power as they did as a result of Gideon Saar joining last September, as I mentioned earlier. I think the main characteristic of Netanyahu is that he is the most unbelievable political survivor. There's nothing that it seems that he can't survive. And that will be certainly put to the test once the war is over, because then there'll be the almighty reckoning about what went wrong on October the 7th to allow such a catastrophe to hit the Jewish state. And of course, that was the culmination of many, many years of Netanyahu rule, where he presided over what was called in Israel the concept of containing Hamas and other enemies over the border while pursuing domestic economic development at home. And that was shown to be very, very flawed indeed on October the 7th, when Hamas were able to break through the border. And so certainly Netanyahu does carry a lot of the responsibility for that. But let's wait and see what the inquiry turns up. In Israel, a week is a lifetime in politics. And when Netanyahu is concerned, he's survived so much. The polls were dipping so much after October the 7th, they then came back up in his favour. So I think he's down, but certainly not out.
And Paul, what is actually now left of Hamas? I mean, obviously their top tier leadership have all basically been taken out. I mean, is it just a few guerrilla fighters left, or are there enough people there to sort of regroup and rule the Gaza Strip again?
I think Hamas can certainly regroup. Even if you killed every single Hamas member, those Hamas members would have sons or brothers or cousins who would step forward. Israel may have won a tactical victory here. Certainly, whenever the IDF comes face to face with Hamas, it's Hamas which is worst off. But if you look at the generational struggle, I don't know whether we believe that 44,000 people have been killed in Gaza and how many of those are fighters, but a lot of civilians have been killed in Gaza. Some people are angry, direct their anger towards Hamas because of that, but a lot of people are bent on vengeance. And so in 10 or 15 years' time, Hamas will be back. They're back now. I think something like 10 Israeli soldiers were killed over the past week by Hamas fighters who were taking unexploded bombs dropped from the air, rewiring them and making IEDs out of them. It's almost impossible to destroy a guerrilla army. The conventional army loses by not winning. The guerrilla army wins by not losing. And then in the generational struggle, you have a lot of people bent on revenge. So this is a temporary and tactical victory for Israel, nothing more than that, I'm afraid.
And who do you envision sort of ruling officially the Gaza Strip? I mean, will it be Fatah, the Palestinian Authority? I mean, presumably the Israelis are not going to allow Hamas as an official body to be taking charge again.
Well, this is one of the great unanswered questions of this deal. The Israeli military does not want to occupy Gaza. It doesn't have the manpower for it. It was no less a figure than Ariel Sharon who decided that was untenable and withdrew from Gaza. Hardliners in the Israeli government don't want Fatah and the Palestinian Authority back. So it's a question really of whether their influence has been diluted sufficiently for that to happen. And it's very difficult for the Palestinian Authority to be seen riding in behind Israeli tanks, literally or figuratively. There was some talk about different Gaza clans being invited by Israel to take a hand in ruling Gaza. One of those clans I remember was involved in kidnapping a former BBC colleague of mine under the guise of Al-Qaeda. So whether these clans were using the Al-Qaeda flag to mask regular criminal enterprise or what, I don't know. But it might not necessarily be better than Hamas, whatever comes afterwards. So that's quite chaotic, really. Would there be an Arab peacekeeping force of some kind? None of these details have been worked out. For the time being, we just have to get through the next couple of weeks between the first lot of hostages being released and the second lot of hostages being released before the ceasefire breaks down. But to return to this question of the inquiry that has been forestalled by the war, the inquiry starts. They might look at what's happened between May, when the same deal was put by Biden, and today. Have things changed so much? And if they haven't, that's a lot of Palestinian civilians killed. That's a lot of Israeli soldiers killed for a deal that Mr. Netanyahu could have accepted last May.
Of course, one thing that we have seen in terms of Israeli military gains was the killing of Yahya Sinwar and the taking of Rafah and the securing of the Philadelphia corridor in the south. These things were vital strategic gains in the war. They enabled the Israelis to cut off the smuggling lifeline. The smuggling tunnels all come into Rafah in the south, enabled Israel to kill Hamas's iconic leader, and of course to rout out the last sort of fortress of Hamas in Rafah. And now, as Paul pointed out, Hamas it resembles a guerrilla force rather than a sort of light infantry, which was what Israel faced in the beginning of the war. And in that way, Israel has been following the plan that it laid out right at the start of hostilities, which were airstrikes, ground invasion, mopping up a guerrilla force. But as Paul correctly pointed out, nobody knows what the day after is going to look like, even a year and a bit since the war began. And that is a serious problem, because if you can't put something else in place, then Hamas or some other terror group will inevitably fill that vacuum. So that's the big question we're all facing right now.
It's interesting that the Israelis have had 15 months to, worry about the day after the war. It seems strange that there wouldn't be more sort of strategic knowledge about what the strategy is, or is it just a case that it isn't being shared with the public?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's just a very, very difficult problem to solve. As Paul mentioned, the Palestinian leadership is on the West Bank is very weak, very corrupt, and very inept, and would be unwilling probably to ride in behind Israeli tanks into Gaza, and would probably face some stiff resistance from Hamas and Hamas sympathizers in Gaza. But if not them, then whom? You can't occupy the Strip again from an Israeli point of view. I don't see any Arab powers stepping forward to take control of Gaza in a coalition. So it's a very difficult problem to solve. But the other element, of course, is the political one. And over the last year and a bit, the far right have had control over Netanyahu's coalition, and they do not want to see any kind of Palestinian self-rule in Gaza. In fact, many of them want to see Gaza reoccupied by Israel, which is not what the majority opinion is in Israel by any stretch. But they've got this disproportionate power because they are kingmakers in the coalition. And there's some truth, I think, in the fact that that's delayed a deal from being done, and has also delayed any kind of planning for the day after in Gaza.
And Paul, just very quickly, on sort of away from the actual ruling of the Gaza Strip, on the day after the war ends, who's going to be funding the rebuilding of Gaza, and how might that affect the sort of geopolitics of the region?
Well, the hat will be passed round in a way that it often is for these kinds of appeals. The UN, which will do its own fundraising, the EU. But I think a country like Qatar will be central to this. They have been central to the negotiations. They were funding Hamas before, with Mr. Netanyahu's blessing. It's one of the things the inquiry is going to be looking into. But I think the immediate Arab neighbours, like Qatar, they will be the ones, and it's going to be huge. Look at the pictures coming out of Gaza. Street after street just flattened. There's an immense amount of rebuilding to do. And I think, however deep the pockets of a country like Qatar, this is not going to be easy or quick. It's going to be years before anything like the Gaza that was there before is restored. And of course, you can't replace all the lives lost.
Over in America, firefighters in LA finally had some respite from the raging wildfires there. Freddie Gray joins Robert Bryce, an energy specialist, to talk about what led to the disaster.
Robert, obviously these fires are a terrible disaster for everybody living in the area. It's been seen as a sort of fitting epitaph for the Biden presidency in many ways, democratic misrule and so on. And yet I heard Governor Gavin Newsom of California talking about Los Angeles 2.0, what might rise up from the ashes of this disaster. What do you think that would look like, Los Angeles 2.0?
Well, first I'll just say good luck to him, because the challenges here are just enormous. So there's a lot of effort now at finger pointing and what caused the fires, who's to blame, what didn't happen, what should have happened, et cetera. And thinking about this and talking, my father was in the insurance business. My brother's in the insurance business, has been his whole career. I think if we look forward, there are a couple of things that are very obvious that are unavoidable now for both Angelenos and for Californians in general. One is that in the wake of this, insurance rates in the state are going to skyrocket. I mean, they were already high, and you had a couple of major insurance carriers refusing to provide property insurance in the state. Now you have the state, and they created what I think they call the FAIR Plan, which was a state-backed insurance entity, but its coverage was minimal. And so a lot of homes, they were only providing a fraction of the value of the replacement, or rather a fraction of the coverage that would be required for replacement value. So the state is now going to see across the board higher insurance rates for all kinds of property. And that's going to affect all Californians, whether they're homeowners or renters. So this is going to be add yet more fuel to the fire, pun intended here, on the cost of living problems in California. And why does this matter? Well, first, it's that California has the highest poverty rate of any state in America. And that poverty rate is so high because of the cost of living. And in fact, the cost of the poverty rate in the state has nearly doubled just in the past 2 years. So these are shocking numbers. So you have now, in the wake of the fires, this inflationary aspect in insurance, which people seldom think about unless they, as my brother Wally says, you have a claim or you can't get insurance. And then the other is what's going to happen on electricity prices, which again are already among the highest in the state of California, are among the highest in the country. They're nearly double the U.S. average. All of the utilities now are going to be spending much more money on wildlife mitigation, preparedness, undergrounding power lines. All of this is going to make those insurance prices go yet higher. So those are things that are obvious. I also want to point out that my friend Joel Kotkin had a very good piece in Unheard just the other day saying, well, how is the state going, or how is Los Angeles now possibly going to host the 2028 Olympics? Or this is only 3 years away. And, the state doesn't have any money. They have a massive deficit. They're not going to have enough housing in Los Angeles. They're already chronically short of housing. Gavin Newsom and Trump hate each other. So, the president's not going to step in and say, oh, we'll do anything for you, whatever. And meanwhile, the city's looking ahead at these obligations for the Olympics. Those things I think are pretty obvious right now and are really unfortunate. And, the losses here are staggering already, and they're just getting thoroughly assessed at the moment.
And I suppose what it's shone a light on is the broader mismanagement of California as a state. You mentioned poverty there, but it's also there are staggering statistics on things like literacy. California has very low rates of literacy. And I think for Brits, we still think of California as this dreamy sunshine state that everybody would like to live in. But the reality has become something of a nightmare, hasn't it?
The mismanagement here, and now who's to blame? Well, the leadership in the state now, which has been a Democratic state, there has been no bipartisan rule in the state now for decades. It's been thoroughly run by the Democratic Party and the extreme progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And what have they done? They've been spending massive amounts of money on energy and climate policies, and even ever more restrictive mandates in terms of energy and climate, mandating solar panels on every home, driving up the cost of housing in a state that is chronically short of housing. And now you have in Los Angeles alone, at least 10,000 structures. I don't know the number of homes that have now been destroyed, but where are those people going to go? I mean, there's nowhere. It's not that the state has a lot of excess homes for them to move into. So in the near term, you're going to see this massive problem of just accommodating all these displaced people. Yeah, some of them are rich and they can move, and a lot of them are going to come to Texas, and I'm sure a lot of them are going to move here to Austin. But you're creating a compounding series of problems, and especially when this exodus out of California has already begun. A lot of wealthy Californians are going to leave, and that means the people who stay are going to face a yet higher tax burden. So multiple things that are unfolding, I think, that are easily kind of seen at the moment, but as they play out, it's just going to further compound the disasters that this feckless leadership has inflicted on California.
And the conversation seems to be slightly different in America to what it is here. I mean, here the story is being discussed on major news programs, debate shows, and so on, still very much within the context of climate change. Whereas I feel that in America, possibly because of the incoming Trump presidency, there's been far more of a realistic look at how massive spending on climate change policies, anti-climate change policies, mitigation policies, $50 billion, I think, California has committed to addressing climate change. But the conversation in America seems to be real anger that hasn't amounted to any protection for its citizens from these wildfires.
Right. So let me just talk about the climate change part of this. So yes, this has been the narrative, particularly in, let me call it legacy media, right? And there is a massive clack of reporters and media outlets who want to say, oh, well, this is all about climate change. That's just too glib. It's too easy. Now, this problem that has built up over decades in California is multifaceted, right? There's never just one reason for these kinds of disasters. You have development in the foothills in California in places that wouldn't be allowed now. You have this buildup of brush over years and especially the last few months after a lot of rain last year, and then they didn't clear the brush, which is a management issue. You have chronic mismanagement at the LA Department of Water and Power, which I wrote about on my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. The title was Asleep at the Switch. Here is the biggest municipal utility in the country, and they had a wildfire mitigation plan. But if you look at their annual report, it's just a tiny one-paragraph mention. What do they talk about throughout the rest of their report? Diversity, equity, inclusion, all this stuff about racial equality and climate change, instead of thinking about what are their potential catastrophic failure points. And fire was clearly one of them. So a lot of this effort in California and governmental focus has been on a lot of progressive politics, a lot of, climate change discussions, energy, the right thinking that's being, correct thinking rather, being guided by these leftist progressive ideologies that had nothing to do with the most basic functions of government. And that's what I think is causing such outrage in California today among, what have traditionally been the left, the Hollywood actors, et cetera, saying, look, we've been betrayed here.
It's often said that the climate change ideology behind the progressive ideology that drives a lot of these policies is similar to a religion. And looking at the reactions of some people, you do see that, don't you? That it's really, if you are to talk about how they could have done mitigation better or, cleared the brush and so on, you're committing heresy for a lot of people because you're not addressing the God that is climate change.
Well, I'm happy to be a heretic then, put me in in that camp. I will gladly, sit there. Look, the reality is about climate change. Here's my view in a nutshell. Yes, climate change is a concern. It's not our only concern. And it is not the sole reason why these fires happened. California has been hit by wildfires forever. And I do mean forever. It's part of that ecosystem in that coastal area where Los Angeles is. So, and the same with the Santa Ana winds that were the ones that fanned the fire, that fanned the flames, that made this so such a destructive disaster. But let's talk about some of the potential losses here. The AccuWeather, and I don't know where they're getting this number, they tripled their estimated losses from the fires from $50 billion to up to $150 billion. Now, how much of that will be uninsured losses, we don't know. But you're already seeing the big insurance carriers in the U.S. reporting that they're going to take multi-billion-dollar hits. You're going to have homeowners that will be that won't have enough coverage, and so they won't be able to rebuild. And then again, casting this forward, California's permitting system and bureaucracy is just unbelievably complicated. Now, Newsom just in the last few days says he's going to suspend all the environmental regs so that they can rebuild quickly. Okay, that's fine. But you're already in a state that has very high labor prices, and you've lost 20,000 homes. Where are you going to find the labor? What about all the sheetrock, the lumber, the building materials? All of these things are going to come together and they will slowly manifest themselves over the coming years. But, if you're trying to rebuild and you can't get insurance or the insurance is too high and you need a mortgage, well, you're screwed.
A lot of people saying that FEMA, the Federal Emergencies Management Agency, should be the person to pick up the tab here, but people are saying that it's run out of money. Is that true?
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
I can't speak to that. I don't know that, Freddie. That's a good question. What I can say is that, Trump and Newsom don't like each other. And Newsom, had been disparaging Trump all along. He had convened a special legislative session. And I think maybe it's already being gavelled in this week. I'm trying to remember. But they're creating a special session about how to fight Trump in the new administration. And now Trump is coming into office and suddenly Newsom needs Trump. Oh, well, gee. Trump, I'm no fan. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat, but Trump has a long memory and he has no love lost for California. And so, will the federal government help? I'm sure they will, but it would be far different if Kamala Harris were in the White House. I'll tell you that.
And regardless of what one might think of Trump, I think it's indisputable that he's been vindicated because he's talked a lot about Californian wildfires, the dangers of mismanagement. He's talked about the forest brush. He's talked about a program to protect a little tiny fish, as he calls it, the smelt, which has ended up sort of diverting a lot of water into the Pacific Ocean, so that a lot of California is effectively a kind of pyre of farmland. He's been right about this, hasn't he?
Well, and isn't it, it's funny. What's the joke that just because Trump says it doesn't mean it's wrong? It's like, and that seems to be the case. But, LADWP, to bring it back to this agency, which is the biggest municipally owned utility in America. They have something like 8,000 megawatts of generation. They serve 4 million Angelinos, water and power. But they had drained a reservoir that was above Pacific Palisades in order to do some repair. And well, why are you doing that now? And this was you can debate whether that water would have been valuable during the fire, whether any quantity of water would have been enough to, stop a fire of this magnitude. But nevertheless, this, in fact, I think it was the owner of the LA Times. I forgot his name. He's a physician. He just pointed out that, all we want in our politicians is competence, and in our leadership is competence. And what we are seeing is a tremendous lack of competence. And some of these things that you've seen in the leadership, LADWP, the woman who heads it, her name is Janice Quinones, I think. She gave an interview last summer saying, well, our first focus is on equity and diversity. And, well, wait a minute, shouldn't your first focus be on making sure people have water and power? I mean, it seems like that's your job. And she's being paid $750,000. And one other thing that I have to mention, I assume you saw it. I've watched politics for a long time. I'm an old guy. I'm 64. I've been watching politics since I was a kid. The interview that the LA mayor, Karen Bass, gave after she got back from Ghana, where the reporter was peppering her with questions, she just stood there and didn't have a response. I've seen a lot of political train wrecks right in my career, but that bit of footage is maybe the worst. I mean, or a politician melting down on camera. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, just truly incredible. And she's not going to be reelected. There's another prediction for you.
Well,
if she doesn't resign before or is booted out or recalled, but yeah, she's a one-term mayor.
And she's being blamed not just for cutting $20 million from the fire department budget, of the Los Angeles Fire Department budget, but also for sort of obviously woke, highly progressive mindset policies were being put in place in fire departments. So they were trying to reach diversity quotas and so on. And we see this again and again in America. I mean, we saw it when Trump was nearly assassinated, and there were sort of exposés about what had been going on with the Secret Service, and there were diversity quotas there. And that obviously has an impact on each institution, each group's ability to respond to crises or to do their jobs effectively.
Sure. And again, this is something where this DEI, ESG, going back to LADWP, you look at their annual report, and on the third page, they show their leadership, and it's like 9 people listed. And I think his name is Jesse Owens. If that's right. I'm forgetting it. Let me just look here, because I just want to make sure I get it right. Yeah, it's on the third page. And Greg Reed, forgive me, Jesse Owens, somebody else. Greg Reed, he is the senior assistant general manager, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So they have in their top management ranks somebody whose only job is DEI. Well, isn't the job of your business to deliver water and power? And instead, this just betrays, what the focus of the agency has been. And by the way, I just pulled it up. It's the Santa Ynez Reservoir, which is in the Palisades Highlands. It holds 117 million gallons of water. It was drained for repairs. And so that water wasn't available for the firefighters. And one other quick point about the water availability. It was 10 years ago, I think California residents voted for the construction of 3 dams or 4 dams. I've forgotten how many, but to fund new reservoirs. None of them have been built. This is, again, example of the rank incompetence of the leadership in the state. And I think I don't like this word, but I think it's the right word, is the betrayal of the California population by their leadership on not being, as the owner of the LA Times put it, just showing competence, and it's shining through right now.
Well, and that Californian population, a lot of them are moving out of California. You mentioned people going to the state that you're in, Texas. A lot of them will go to Austin. But it is worth remembering, is it not, that California is still the home of Silicon Valley, which is probably one of the, if not the biggest drivers of wealth in the world. And for California to have all these problems of poverty, of education, of general mismanagement, while being still a very rich state in many ways, is quite staggering.
It is, and you make a good point. And but I'll add to what you said. Yes, there is no doubt that Silicon Valley has created a lot of wealth and a lot of super wealthy people. oligarchs. I mean, they've effectively become oligarchs, Zuckerberg and Laurene Powell Jobs and, the rest of them, Larry Ellison. But the Silicon Valley doesn't really create manufacturing jobs. In fact, it doesn't create many jobs at all. And what do the working class, what do the poor and the middle class, the working class, what do they need? They need jobs where they work with their, not all of them, but they need people who work with their hands. They need the middle class, and that's who's being squeezed here. So yes, to go back where we started the conversation, these fires, and they're still ongoing. And there's no indication that I've seen about when they're going to be extinguished and how much more losses are going to be, and how many more losses are going to be incurred. But it's just going to further exacerbate this massive disparity between the super, super rich in California and everyone else. And now the super, super rich, including, Pacific Palisades was not necessarily only the wealthy there, but who's going to have to go in and do all the work to rebuild? It's going to be the working class. Are there enough of them? Are they going to be available? What are they going to charge? I mean, again, that's the concern I have as I look at the U.S. system and I look around the world. I'm not really focused on left-right issues. I think what the real disparity is, it's between the top and the bottom. It's the class issues, and that's another thing that my friend Joel Kotkin has written a lot about. That what we're seeing is really the conflict between the super wealthy and the rest of the population.
Well, and I think it's Joel Kotkin who writes about neo-feudalism, and
that's right.
California does seem to be a pretty prime example of this. It's almost like a undeveloped or third world country in many ways, in that you don't really have a middle class. You've just got very, very rich people and a sort of slave class or underneath them.
Yeah, I mean, slave class might be a little strong, but I think that, yes, I mean, it's just that the working class is being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed harder and harder and harder. And the wealthy are mobile. They can afford to move. They can afford right now, they can afford to be in hotels and motels, and there aren't enough of those. But, what's the situation going to look like in a year, in 2 years, in 3.5 years when the Olympics are supposed to open in LA? I talked to Joel Kotkin. I consider him a good friend of mine. I talked to him last night, and he said, remember, the last time LA had the Olympics was 1984. Ronald Reagan was president in 1984. And so there was a natural affinity between the federal government and California at that time. And he points out there were a lot of other corporations, big businesses in California that were manufacturers, aircraft industry, others that, were part of the fabric of the system in California. Well, a lot of that manufacturing activity has gone overseas or gone to other states. You have now, I think, I'm not going to say real hatred, but a great deal of dislike between the president and the governor of California. And so all these things have, are a dramatic difference from 1984 when the LA Olympics were held and were considered one of the most successful in the U.S. Hosting of the Olympics. But, it's also indescribably, just on a personal note, my daughter has been living in LA and she recently flew to Mexico City to get away from the fires, but it's all just so indescribably sad. And, to see the destruction of, what has been a truly great city in America, and this destruction from the fires, but it's been, the result, I think, of a long, slow degradation of the competence and the ability of the governing class in California to take care of its people.
And another point that isn't really talked about is the actual pollution caused by this fire. So the failure to mitigate wildfires or to come up with ecologically reasonable programs that would stop fires happening has caused an environmental catastrophe in and of itself.
That's an interesting point. And I've thought about that a little bit, but I also think, okay, well, how does this happen now? What's the cleanup going to look like now? How is this going to, go from here? And I think it's going to require a massive amount of diesel fuel, right? You look at all those homes that have been leveled. What are they going to do? Well, you're going to have to get a bulldozer in there. You're going to have to get a front end loader, and you're going to have trucks that are going to have to haul all of that debris away. And where are they going to put it? How many landfills are going to be needed to take all of that that waste. That's one part of it. And yes, there's going to be toxic air. There's going to be the dust, the ash. All of these things are part of that. What you're talking about. And then how are they going to get permits? What are you where's the concrete going to come from? All of these things. Any kind of rebuilding effort, reconstruction effort requires massive amounts of hydrocarbons in a state that has said they want to eliminate internal combustion engines. I mean, the energy realism is going to have to, come to the fore here because there's just no other choice.
Well, and as discussed on the last time we had you on, Robert, energy realism is coming to the fore in the shape of the Trump administration, the new Energy Secretary, Chris Wright. Doug Burgum is going to have a senior role there too. There is energy realism on the horizon.
I spoke to my friend Greg Grugan. He's a TV reporter in Houston, and he came to Austin. He interviewed me last week, and I said, what we're about to see is the biggest. It's a 180-degree pivot from the Biden administration to the Trump administration. This is going to be the biggest reversal of energy policies that we've seen in modern American history. And I'm very hopeful. I consider Chris Wright a friend of mine. He's a brilliant guy. He's entrepreneurial, and he's a humanist. And instead of demonizing energy, he sees energy as needed for people. And he's an energy humanist, and he's been very successful in business and shown a true compassion and a humanism that has been needed in that spot. And I don't know if we talked about it before, but he's the first Secretary of Energy in the U.S. And remember, this agency was created in the Carter administration to actually come from the energy industry. Heretofore, it's been a cause for disqualification. We've never had an energy person as the energy secretary. Ronald Reagan appointed a dentist. I mean, so it's like finally we have someone in that spot who knows what they're talking about. It's I'm really hopeful that they can do some good things there, particularly on the nuclear front.
This week, there were reports that the former head of Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams, may be in line for a payout from the British state after Labour repealed legislation related to the Troubles. I'm joined by Arlene Foster, the former head of the DUP and First Minister of Northern Ireland, to discuss whether that might happen or not. I think a lot of people have been horrified to see headlines today along the lines of Gerry Adams is set to receive a large payout from the UK taxpayers. A lot of people will be pretty confused about that as well. I think we'll get a bit more into the detail of this in a bit, but can you maybe start us off by explaining in a brief as you can, kind of how we've ended up in this situation, how we ended up here?
Yeah, sure. So Gerry Adams took a case claiming that he had been wrongfully detained back in the 1970s, and it's made its way up to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that his detention was unlawful for the reason that it was a junior minister had signed off his incarceration, as it were, and it should have been the Secretary of State because it was the Secretary of State that had been given the power in the legislation. For years, this has been happening. I think since the 1940s, it's called the Carltona principle, where if a Secretary of State is given power, then he can ask his junior ministers. And in Northern Ireland, don't forget, this would have been the Minister of State in charge of security to sign off on these interim custody orders. So the Supreme Court came to this decision. A lot of legal experts have looked at it since then and said that it was wrong. And the government actually, when it was the Conservative government dealing with the Northern Ireland Legacy Bill, decided after amendments had been placed by a number of peers to deal with this issue and to say that, look, we're going to legislate for this. Parliament is sovereign. Everybody, nobody spoke out against this. Everybody agreed with it right across the House, including the then opposition, the now government. And so sections 46 and 47 of the legislation went through. And that was right, because it meant that we were reinstating this principle, and it also meant that Gerry Adams, and indeed many others, couldn't claim compensation for being interned.
So, Arlene, what we've ended up in a situation now is that Labour are looking to repeal the legislation, partly because human rights challenges have been launched and partly because of criticism from victims. The side effect of this is that it will allow Gerry Adams, for example, to claim compensation. What's your view on the actual repeal of the legislation itself? Do you think that's necessary and right?
Well, I can understand why Labour have decided that they're going to deal with the issue that they stood on an election manifesto commitment on, which was the repeal of the Northern Ireland Legacy Act. Though that was principally their principal concern about what that was in relation to amnesties, and I absolutely understand that. But they are keeping parts of the legislation in place. So the legislation set up an independent commission for reconciliation and information retrieval. It sits in Belfast under the chairmanship of former Lord Chief Justice, and it's still in existence. They're not repealing that, but they are repealing sections 46 and 47, or they have indicated they're going to repeal those. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. It's fundamentally wrong because Parliament has made it clear that they want these sections to remain in place. You're right to mention the human rights challenge which came about from the High Court in Belfast. But the government have decided not to appeal against that determination, which is wrong. And they could appeal against that determination. I think actually they can't now because they're out of time and they indicated that they should have. But the way to deal with this is to leave sections 46 and 47 in the legislation as operable. And I notice that the Prime Minister in question time has said that he will look to find all means to stop Adams et al. Being able to claim compensation. But a very simple way of doing that is to leave section 46 and 47 on the books, as it were. And I say that from a justice point of view, from a public interest point of view, but also very much from victims in Northern Ireland and across the UK, because victims, innocent victims, since the Belfast Agreement was signed in 1998, have had to deal with an awful lot. And they've been overlooked in very many occasions, at best. And in many times they've been re-traumatized. And I think for an innocent victim to look at this news today, to see that they have lost a loved one to IRA violence, and now, by the way, Gerry Adams is going to get compensation. It is really, really difficult. And I think the government doesn't need to involve itself in any of this. All it needs to do is to say, we should have appealed the High Court in Belfast. We didn't. But what we're going to do is to leave section 46 and 47 on the books. And by doing that, then we're not going to have to pay compensation to Gerry Adams and indeed many others as well.
So just to be clear, Arlene, can the government leave section 46 and 47 on the books without appealing against the High Court decision in Belfast?
Well, I'm not clear about that. It's a very good question. They should have, of course, appealed against the decision. I think they may be out of time now. There may be another mechanism which they can apply to the court to have a declaration, and then if that declaration isn't given, then appeal against that. I'm sure there are other mechanisms to deal with this issue of section 46 and 47, but the core issue is that the Parliament has made its views very clear on this issue. Parliament is supreme. Courts are there to interpret the law, but the law was very clear that people should not be able to claim compensation who are terrorists for what they deem to be illegal custody because of a technicality, and that's the issue. It is a technicality that causes this case to be brought.
I mean, do you have any sympathy with the view? I mean, it's probably worth stressing at this point that this sort of decision doesn't just affect Adams, and it does affect other people who are interned as well. I mean, sort of critics of the legislation would maybe say these people were unlawfully interned, they should be able to claim compensation as a result of it. Do you have any sympathy with that view?
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, I don't really, from this point of view, it's a technical argument. It's not about the rights and wrongs of internment, and goodness, if we were to talk about that podcast would be a very long one. But I'm simply making the point that this is a very technical argument. It's something that happened in government for very many years, that ministers of state could exercise the power of the Secretary of State on his behalf. The court ruled against that. It came back to Parliament, and Parliament made its view very clear. So I think it's quite a simple. A lot of people might say it's a very complicated issue, looking at it in terms of courts and Parliament and all of those different things. But actually, at the core, it's a very straightforward issue. Do we want a society that says to people like Gerry Adams that what you did is okay, and in fact, we're going to give you compensation because of a technical issue that happened in the very early 1970s? I don't think that that's right, and therefore I think government should find a way to deal with this issue.
Do you think some of this, Arlene, comes from, I mean, a lot of people have remarked on Keir Starmer's own human rights law background. Do you think he has a sort of very legalistic way of looking at things and sort of saying, well, judges have said this, therefore we need to act? Do you think that's where this comes from, maybe, that he's ended up in this pickle?
Yeah, I certainly think there's a bit of that. And another issue we could spend a long time speaking about today is the Chagos Island deal, which I am completely opposed to, where they are interpreting what wasn't a legally binding judgment of a court into making this really bad deal with the Mauritian government, which hopefully will not now go ahead because of a new president in the United States. I really hope that is the case. But yes, there is a certain determination. It's almost a shift from Parliament to the courts. If a judge says so, then it is so, instead of actually respecting the parliamentary sovereignty, which of course is what our constitution and great country is based upon. So I do think there is an element of that, absolutely.
I should say as well, Robert Jenrick has drawn attention to the fact that Keir Starmer's Attorney General, Lord Hermer, has previously represented Gerry Adams. Jenrick has said we need to know whether Hermer was involved in this decision or not, that has sort of paved the way for Adams to receive compensation. Is that something you agree with?
Well, I think we should know whether he was involved in any determinations, because of course that would be a very clear conflict of interest, bringing from his professional life into what is now, of course, a government role. So I think it's a fair point that he should make his views clear. But it is a much wider issue. This principle was agreed in Parliament in terms of Section 46 and 47, not just by Conservatives or crossbenchers or people from Northern Ireland like myself. It was agreed by everybody, including the Labour peers at that time. And indeed, when it went back and was confirmed in the House of Commons, it was agreed as well across the House. So this is not something that was of contention. There was plenty of contention over the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill. There certainly was. But this was one area where everybody agreed in Parliament. So that's why I think it's inexplicable that they didn't appeal this. It was wrong not to appeal it. So now there has to be a way found to deal with this issue. And I very much hope government will, that they won't drag their heels in this and that they will find a solution to this, which not only deals with the wider issue of the Cartona principle, but stops people who shouldn't be entitled to compensation claiming for compensation.
We should mention as well that Gerry Adams is appearing in court next year in a civil case brought by IRA victims. What hopes do you have for that trial?
Well, as you know, Gerry Adams has always maintained that he was never a member of the IRA. That's something that he continues to maintain. It has been ridiculed widely, not just in Northern Ireland, but across the world. And I think it's very brave and very courageous of an IRA victim to take him to court to deal with that issue once and for all. And as I understand it, that civil case will be coming to court later on, spring, summer of this year. And that's something we should watch very closely. And I know that they're crowdfunding, and I want to make a plea for them. If anybody's interested in this case, they should go online and help with that case, because it's a very important case. This man has maintained this sort of charade for many, many years, despite the fact that he was negotiating on behalf of that organisation. He maintains this charade that he was never a member of the IRA. So this case is very important, and I'll watch with interest how it develops.
And finally, Arlene, I mean, some critics of the Legacy Act have kind of pointed to this case of Adams being brought before a civil court and said it wouldn't be possible if the Legacy Act were in place at the time it was launched. I mean, what do you say to that, given your own views on the legislation?
Well, the Legacy Act came from a good place insofar as it came from a place where it was trying to stop vexatious claims against people who were there for all of the right reasons in the 70s and 80s, trying to stand between anarchy and good governance in Northern Ireland. And so it came from a very good place, but its development then led to great difficulties, particularly with a lot of victims who felt that their story was not being heard, and indeed in the future they would not be able to take cases. I'm very pleased that this civil case is proceeding. I think it's very important that it's heard and it's dealt with, and as I say, I look forward to seeing the outcome of it later on in the year.
Today I'm joined by Baroness Emma Nicholson. We're going to be talking about the creative arts, culture and the culture wars. Emma, thank you so much for joining us on Spectator TV. Now, we've got a lot of things to talk about, but one of the key things I want to ask you about is the creative arts, and we'll take it from there. Lisa Nandy is the Culture Minister, and at the beginning of her new job, she said, the era of the culture wars is over. Now, there's been a year-long row in the Royal Literature Society that I'm sure you've been across. What do you think? Is the era of culture wars over?
The culture war is just boiling up to peak and go down again. And I'm afraid we have to thank Mr. Trump for that, because he's decided to punch the culture war in the stomach and let it collapse completely. And he's already started. It's frustrating to have the USA start to resolve our problem. But I have been very, very shocked indeed by the writing world in the UK recently. The Royal Society's behaviour is really unacceptable. But I'm not surprised, because when I came out in terms of countering the culture war's bizarre belief that men can become women, heaven help them, the people who threw me off their boards immediately were writing boards. The Booker Prize, which my late husband had founded and ran for a very long time, very successfully and creatively. And also the Michael Morpurgo board threw me off as well, of children's writing. And I was absolutely astonished at the weakness of writers here, authors here. Now, a whole great group of people called the Wild Women's Writing Club came out in favour. But I come from a background where I chaired for 20 years, when my late husband died, the Booker Prize for Russian fiction against Mr. Putin. And we hung on, they wrote, we were open, everything was honest, wonderful creative writing against Mr. Putin. And he only managed to close us down 2 years ago. Those are real writers. Who are these people here?
Let's go back to what happened with the Booker Prize. So it was your late husband that set it up, and it was in 2020 you were embroiled in a row. What happened?
In 2020, I had been reading carefully the background about the transgender world. Why did I bother when it was nothing to do with me? I'm a member of the House of Lords and nothing more. Because some nurses came to see me, young nurses, and they'd been sacked because they didn't agree with telling patients that men could be women. And they said it was against the training, it was against the examinations, and they couldn't do it. What was the outcome? They were sacked. Soon after they came to see me, 2 teachers came to see me. They too had refused to tell their pupils. They were new teachers, recently qualified, lovely young women. They'd lost their entire careers and were not going to be rehired, and the same with the nurses. I was so shocked that young women could lose their jobs like that on the basis of an untruth when they were trying to be accurate scientifically and logically, that I actually looked into it quite hard. And that led me to moving in on understanding a little bit better by dint of getting onto Twitter, now X. And there I was opposed by a ferocious pack of vixens, really. I mean, really enormous, of, I think, mainly gentlemen saying they were women, and somehow I had ruffled their hair in a way. And they were very, very angry and demanded that I should be removed from the Booker. And the Booker at that time was not of the calibre that my late husband had left it, which was really magnificent, highly regarded, and very, very hard work for him as well. And they threw me off their little advisory board, which was odd because the Modern Book had been set up by myself and another person they threw off. They threw 3 people off at once as an excuse to getting rid of me. And we had been the people who had registered the current Booker as a charity after the Booker Prize itself was dropped from the company that ran it.
How were you told?
The Booker board threw me off by sending me a letter telling me that I was no longer part of it. They had 3 or 4 of us who'd helped set it up before the current group came, and they threw us all off. It was completely crazy because the other 3 were really outstanding people. A very, very senior person in the House of Lords, an enormously famous playwright who was very elderly, and someone else as well. I thought they were very, very badly behaved, apart from anything, and also rather silly. And they said that I was unacceptable to them. Okay, fair enough, I'm unacceptable. But that's no reason for throwing 3 much more important people off as well. It was a very odd piece of behaviour, and it didn't make me look at the Booker Prize for English fiction in the same light as before. I think they've... but really it worried me that writers should want to do this.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's writers that should be the ones that champion free speech.
That is what is happening in Russia. It is the writers who stood out and insisted on writing against Mr. Putin, who only would accept writing. It was exactly what he wanted said. And all the writers who were with me on the Booker Prize for Russian fiction, people I really admire. Do I admire the current Booker board? No. How can I? I mean, it's their choice. They do what they want. But nonetheless, it's not in the spirit of creative writing and arts, which should be free.
Mm. So let's talk about the Royal Literature Society row, because they've fallen out about Salman Rushdie, they've fallen out about censorship, but they've also fallen out about diversity in selecting who should be part of the Royal Literature Society. Is all of this being driven from the authors themselves, or do you think the business model behind the creative industry has become so woke, to use the term, that they're terrified of not reaching certain quotas, appearing to be so left and liberal? Who's driving this?
I'm not a fan of the current diversity movement because it is significantly undiverse. It is one of the most narrow outfit approaches I've ever seen in my life. For example, we were pushed in the House of Lords, forced to go to some training course. Betty Boothroyd refused, as a result of which they threw her out of the House of Lords, the first ever woman speaker of the House of Commons. They had the cheek of saying she couldn't come near the House of Lords. At the time she refused, she was in any way in operation in hospital. So it shows you the narrowness of the thinking. I went, and I found that it was the least diverse and most expensive caboodle that I'd ever met. Because diversity, if you're going to use the word at all, means all and everyone. And I happen to have been born profoundly deaf. My eyesight took a long walk and didn't come back when I was 9. So I could claim to be handicapped if I really felt like it. I don't. It's just boring. I'm me. But I was fascinated that this diversity excludes handicap. So it's only really interested in other people's sexual behaviour. And I think that's just total vulgarity. Why shouldn't people have a private life? Why should you so-called bring your whole self to work? Heaven forbid you should bring your whole self to work. Most of us don't want to see you. But I think, therefore, that the Royal Society has very much gone down the wrong way. I also think it's already out of date because people have woken up at last. And, I mean, Mr. Trump is one thing, I agree, but over here we've also at last woken up and seen that this whole movement is merely a way of making a slightly unattractive group of people make more money than they should otherwise justify, and give themselves titles and statuses that are not really indicators of their excellence. So I don't think I think the Royal Society is very, very out of date in its approach. But worse than that, when this happened to me, a number of other people came to me in despair. They had been forbidden to display their work. They had been forbidden to get contracts. They weren't allowed to act. They weren't allowed to dance. They weren't allowed to make their clay models. They weren't allowed to embroider. In other words, their creativity had been sidelined and crushed by the very people who should be supporting them. So I don't think there's any business model. I think there should be freedom, which is the fundamental reason that we exist in politics, is freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom to worship, freedom to create. And this whole so-called business model is merely a way of crushing freedom.
A lot of artists and authors will talk about the cuts to funding in the creative arts. And I have a very good friend, she's an opera singer, and one of the topics that we talk about a lot is funding cuts, there's no work. And one of the questions I have is perhaps the creative arts have spent too long relying on government funding and has pushed down quality of production, because if you create a business model that's for profit, you will make high quality things because you want to sell tickets. Do you think that there needs to be a total revamp of the business model in the creative industry so that, yes, you slash the funding, it becomes more privatized, and then the production becomes higher quality?
Well, I'm an honorary officer of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Opera, and I and my colleagues have launched a campaign to get singing particularly back into primary schools, because Michael Gove, in his wisdom, in order to uplift British teaching and outturns on what is called STEM, science, technology, engineering, and so on, cut out all the arts. And without music, I believe that may be why so many children are now being referred to the NHS for mental health problems. I say that very seriously. I'm doing a lot of research on it. We have some funding, because that's exactly the way in which we in the Amar Foundation have been restoring the lives and futures of the Yazidi victims of mass destruction and of genocide. So it's extraordinary what singing can do, and music as a whole, choirs. I'd like to get that choral work back into primary schools. As honorary officer of the opera APPG, I mean, there aren't any young singers coming forward because they're not learning in school. Which means that the only young musicians I can find, the ones who are in quartets and who are singing and so on, went through private education. That means it's a very, very narrow band, and it's both a black mark for private education, yet another one, and for singing. But even worse than that, think of all the talent that is not being found and fostered, and think of the mental health of the children who are brought up with no music.
What do you think about religion and how the lack thereof religion plays in this? Because some people might say that politics has become a new religion, and people are so lacking in faith themselves that they have turned to things like gender ideology or the climate agenda, and they believe it so strongly because they're lacking in their own version of spirituality.
Most of the world belongs to a major faith, and the biggest major faith is, of course, Christianity, and just behind it is Islam. Everything else is shriveled into tininess behind those two huge faiths. So people don't go to church very much, but I don't think that means they don't necessarily believe that there's a higher being, which is the word they use in the alcoholic world, is it? To try to stop drinking. Remember, there's a higher power. It's not just you here. I do think people, if they don't see something like a higher power, which I would call God, they do tend to feel very naked and miserable. And then they start getting vast anxiety complexes and all sorts of things. I don't really think it helps them. We all need to belong. Humans are a collegiate species, and I think we need to belong. And the church is superb at gathering in. What people tend to forget at the moment is that our legislation is based on the second great commandment, love thy neighbour as thyself. So at the end of the day, the British system is there to help. It's not there to own. And that's really what the battle is going on at the moment. Are we going to be able to hold on to that with AI and so on? It's going to take a lot more work than we're giving at the moment. And if we don't, then we will land up with a neo-communist way of doing it, when the state is your owner.
Speaking of communism and the state, we've had 7 months of a Labour government. They have a majority. How do you think they're getting on?
Well, the question is, how are the Labour Party getting on in government? And that's a really triple-edged question, because they're having such difficulties with the most extraordinary things. I guess that the other side of the fence is further away than one tends to think. In other words, within minutes they were wrestling with exactly the same problems we saw that we had been wrestling with, that they felt we should have sorted 5 minutes earlier, and they found exactly the same difficulties. Change in the British system is extremely difficult. You have the same civil service, you have the same circumstances, you have the same budgets, and the question is, how can you be cleverer than your predecessors? So I don't think it's at all easy being in British government. We tried to resolve the issues in the Conservative Party by changing prime ministers. I mean, to a penny.
A few times.
And of course we learned that it wouldn't make any difference at all. The British system doesn't depend upon the Prime Minister, who is primus inter pares. It depends upon the Cabinet and the Parliament, as well as the judiciary and the King. So to think you can change it is a bit unrealistic. We had an election. The electorate said what they wanted, and our job, therefore, is to try to make the best of it, to make the best outcomes for the electorate. It's not at all easy. And I fear they've found immediately how hard it is to run the Treasury, which would seem to be the most important ministry at the moment. So I'm very sorry for them. This is really hard. And I hope for the rest of us that they make a success of it.
Of course. You have had an interesting political career because you haven't always been a Conservative. You crossed the bench. Do they say cross the bench? You crossed...
I crossed the floor in a big rage with the Conservative Party because I'd bumped into some corruption. And coming from a very old-fashioned background of conservatism, I just thought that was unacceptable. And when I pointed it out, of course, people didn't like it, and there was more corruption, there was real corruption, and that came out a bit later on. So I gave evidence to the inquiry on that, and then people were very angry with me. But personally, I think we should work, all of us should work, to have a clean team, whichever side we're on. We should have the cleanest possible House of Commons. So I left and joined the Liberal Democrats, who very kindly allowed me to stand for the European Parliament. And of course, when I got there, I discovered the European Parliament was actually riddled with corruption.
It's really bad.
And the dear old Liberal Democrats were as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my next-door companion was found guilty later on. So
right. Yeah,
corruption is something we've all got to fight.
Yes.
And that's why I shifted. And then quite a long time later, when I came back to the House of Lords, the Conservative Party very kindly, Lord Taylor, then the Chief Whip, invited me to cross the floor back again. And since I was always voting with the Conservatives, as the Liberal Democrats pointed out, rather upset by this, and since I never campaigned against a Conservative candidate, I don't think I was really much good to the Liberal Democrats either. So I've accepted the kind invitation, and the Association of Conservative Peers voted in favour of asking me back again. And so I recrossed the floor and came back again.
What do you think that the Conservative Party needs to do to regroup and to find its identity again?
The Conservative Party needs to support Kemi Badenoch to the hilt. Kemi is great news. I worked with her as a trade envoy for various different countries, and I also worked with her on the transgender issue. She's absolutely first class. So to regroup is not really the word, it's back Kemi and work really hard to make her views happen.
And do you think she can take on the Reform Party?
The Reform Party, I'm rather sorry for them. Any party, any individual that follows Nigel Farage will be disappointed. Because Nigel is a one-man band. And not all politicians are like that. Kemi Badenoch is not, for example. But Nigel is really a one-man band. And that means that those he attracts to himself, because he's not that self-confident, he then pushes them away very quickly. So it won't work. He's not a gatherer. He's an individual of interest, but it won't work.
Well, lots of people might disagree with that because they have now surpassed the Conservative membership. So they have hundreds of thousands of members now, and he's a very clever campaigner. So who's to say that they could break the two-party system and be in the next government?
But you can join with no fear of any worry now, any old party you like, because there's not going to be another election. It's easy to join and say, up yours, I've had enough of the Conservative Party, you misled me X, Y and Z. But it won't actually last. And that's Nigel's inborn weakness. He's not somebody who has the sort of glue that sticks for good. He's the sort of person who has that white glue that comes off when you've used it once. So he's not, in other words, a proper leader. He's interesting, he's fun, I like him, I've done bits of television with him, and he's good fun. But that's not the point. To have somebody steady and stable and big enough and wise enough and serious enough to negotiate globally, that's not Nigel Farage. Remember, I was in the European Parliament with him, and I'm sorry to say there's a really rather unpleasant side to him, really deeply unpleasant. Some of the filthy statements he made in Brussels. That's not a real leader. You've got to have a decent way of looking at life, of respecting others, even if they don't agree with you. For our part, I mean, they might be right in the end, but even if they're not right, their dignity matters, who they are matters, their futures matter. Otherwise, why am I in politics at all? No, Nigel can't stick. It's a nice frivol to join him now, but it means absolutely nothing in 5 years' time, or sooner, 5 weeks' time. People get very disappointed with it, I'm sorry to say. You know, that's why new little parties keep being founded.
Yeah.
And it's terribly easy to make statements about I would do this, I would do that, and I would do the other, if you have no responsibility, no power, and no capacity to alter anything. That's the weakest possible position for a politician.
I want to move on to international politics and talk about the Middle East, because you've done a lot of work there, and a lot of people are talking about the situation in Syria at the moment, and there is a new leader in Syria, Mohammed Abu al-Julani, and it seems like he's trying to make himself come across as a bit of a statesman. However, he has a very Islamist background. Do you have much faith in the future of Syria with him as the leader?
The Syrian people are rather high-quality people. They used to be extraordinarily multifaceted and very intelligent and very well-educated people. I don't know what's been happening under Assad, although I did manage to steal money from Assad's back pocket when he wasn't looking, not once but twice, to use to support the children in northern Lebanon that he had recently thrown out, who needed food and education. So I was rather pleased. I picked his back pocket illicitly, stole the money, and spent it on those children who he'd determinedly thrown out. So he was actually supporting Syrian children in North Lebanon without knowing. I was so pleased I went back for a second go. So hopefully I won't meet him. But
well, he's locked away in Russia. So.
Absolutely. I'm not convinced that the new lot are any better. I think that's slightly different. But no, I have a a wait-and-see mode. I would like to get there and do some charitable work. And if I could find somebody with a pocket to spend that, I would do that. I chair a charity called the Ammar International Charitable Foundation, very, very low cost, working with the World Health Organization and with UNESCO on health and education. That's really what we should be doing in there, all of us. But I haven't yet found any funding to do it.
Do you worry about the Yazidis in Syria?
The Yazidis are a very small, antique, religious little group of people who hardline Islam hates. I don't know why hardline Islam should hate other faiths in the way that it does. To put it bluntly, that's non-Quranic. In the Holy Quran, it says that you should respect other people's faiths. But that's not modern hardline Islam, which is a very nasty breed of belief. And if you look at the background of the new Syrians, you see they founded Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda was the beginning of ISIS, and that nearly crashed the whole of Iraq and vast quantities of the Middle East. So I'm worried for Syria, obviously, but at the moment I can't find a way of helping. My team were working enormously hard in Iraq, north, middle, south, marsh people, Yazidis, everywhere. Tiny charity, always trying to find funding, called the Ammar Foundation, with a great body of volunteers in the States, from Utah, the Latter-day Saints supporting us as well as people here. But it's a tough area, the Middle East, and the acceptance of freedom to believe is key. Freedom to have another faith than just the very narrow way in which you interpret your own faith. It's one of the fundamental freedoms. Freedom of belief, freedom of movement, and so on,
You talk about hardline Islam. Do you think it's come to Britain?
Certainly. There are elements of some of the believers here in Britain who do not accept British law. British law is based, if I could put it this way, on the second great commandment, love thy neighbour as thyself. In other words, it's beneficent law. Hardline Islam is controlling and punishing law. And we may have a crash, which is boiling up, I hope not, because those two ways of looking at things are very different. Either you look at your neighbour as your friend and you want to help them, or you look at your neighbour as your enemy and you want to control them. It's as simple as that. And here in the United Kingdom, coming from a Christian background, whether or not people go to church is fairly irrelevant. It's actually the way in which our legislation is founded on the second great commandment, love thy neighbour as thyself. And if you do that, then you look at them more kindly, and the law is bent that way. If you don't, if you look at it more like communism, except it's not state control, it would be Islamic control, but it's the same thing. It's control, 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 instead of freedom, freedom, freedom. So I think the next decade is going to be on what the fundamental freedoms are. Are we all prepared to go to the death for the fundamental freedoms? I certainly am. For other people, not just for ourselves. And I think that's going to have to be a big part of the discussion in the next decade, here, there, and everywhere.
And finally, our economics editor, Kate Andrews, and our data editor, Michael Simmons, talk about whether or not Rachel Reeves has had her worst week yet. Do tune in.
Michael, the biggest story of the week has got to be the borrowing costs for the UK government. Whilst it does seem like they peaked midweek and are back to where they were at the start of the month, we're still looking at incredibly painful figures for the government, long-term borrowing costs at a 30-year high. They have surpassed where they were at the peak of Liz Truss's mini budget. What do you make of it?
It's a tiny bit of good news in that it started to go back down. But, as you say, these are still, near 30-year high prices for the cost of borrowing, which is not surprising when we have a chancellor that's delivered a budget that the markets don't seem to have faith in. But also, borrowing costs being this high is kind of not surprising when you look at the fact that the country's debt is basically worth 100% of the country's GDP. So when you're in a state like that as an economy, investors, lenders are not going to have faith in your country, to lend to. So yes, it's a tiny bit of good news, but I mean, Rachel Reeves, I would say, is by no means out of any sort of woods. How do you think she's handled it this week?
She's had a surprisingly good week, given the situation is rather dire, as you say, even though it seems like borrowing costs for now have peaked. They're still substantially higher than what the Office for Budget Responsibility predicted around the budget. That is billions and billions of pounds that she has to find that she can't spend on what she might like to spend it on, but that she will need to service the debt. It's not a fun thing to pay off. It's money you've already spent. So I think it's a very tricky situation for her, but I was actually quite surprised how confident she was when she went into the House of Commons to answer questions about her trip to China. But what the opposition parties wanted to talk about was, of course, the borrowing costs and the state of the economy. She came in confident. She left confident. I think a big part of that is that Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, really failed to land a blow. He tried, and other MPs tried. But one thing that was very clear is that the Chancellor is still very happy to say that the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss, crash the economy, despite the fact that borrowing costs are higher than they were at the peak of the mini budget. This is a line Labour is going to continue to use. And Reeves made a calculation in the chamber that I think was correct, which is that the Tories are not going to defend that mini budget. They're not going to defend the fallout. They don't want to engage on that point. So she can keep saying it, and it allowed her to dodge a lot of the questions around what's happened under her own budget. I did a piece for Coffee House at the start of the week pointing out that Reeves and Truss have made a similar miscalculation, and that is that they thought that markets would see what they wanted to do in the medium term, invest, grow the economy, and that they'd finance it. And it doesn't appear to be the case. But there's another point here, Michael, which is that there are external factors at play, that Donald Trump and the threat of tariffs has seen borrowing costs go up for other countries too. But I think this is where the level of debt is so important. I mean, if level of debt in the UK were 60% of GDP or even 70%, it might be slightly different. But leaders now, whether it be the Prime Minister or the Chancellor, they have to calculate for those external events now. Sure, you can try to blame it on those factors, but ultimately you're the one who has to bear the cost.
And do you think, Kate, that the Bank of England has a role in this crisis, in that they themselves are continuing to sell off paper or sell off gilts in a reversal of the years of QE we've gone through?
Well, I think the Bank of England has to make corrections for what we saw during COVID and the role that they played in creating the inflation crisis. Now, look, it's really easy to point fingers in retrospect, but I think one of the biggest criticisms of central banks around the world, certainly at the Bank of England, is that they pretended that all that money printing wasn't going to have any kind of effect on the economy, and that was just so silly. So I think a correction has to take place. But where I think the bank is actually particularly nervous is more around what still pretty high interest rates mean for economic growth. It's fairly, the whole point of raising interest rates is to take heat out of the economy. And even though they're historically normal levels, they seem very high for where we've been. And I think the bank is realizing, or has realized, that it is playing a factor in the fact that the UK basically has no growth. And let's come on to that, because Michael, you made another great graph with the Spectator Data Hub this week. Looking at economic growth, we got the monthly figures for November, which you can see there showed 0.1% of growth. Now, it broke the dreadful cycle of contractions in October and September, but this is not good news.
Yeah, I mean, as you see from the graph, that this is may as well not be growth. It's absolutely nothing to celebrate. Although I'm sure that Rachel Reeves and the Labour government are relieved that, as you say, it's not a contraction. But I think we're going to need things to sort of drastically change if we're to get away from this sort of 0.1% level. And I guess the thing that just always depresses me is just comparing ourselves to America, who, whatever America seemed to do, they grow, and then Britain's just stuck in this stagnation, and no one really seems to me to have any big idea of how we seriously get out of it.
And the way that people react is also quite different, isn't it? Because Joe Biden objectively had pretty good headline growth figures in America throughout his presidency. And yet Americans kept saying that the economy was their number one issue, that they were very worried about the future. We saw the election results. Clearly, there was quite clear rejection of Bidenomics. In the UK, you just have prolonged stagnation, and yet it doesn't feel urgent. It doesn't feel like politicians in any party feel like they have to do something immediately, because it's not to say that I think Britons are okay with it, but as you say, it's more that nobody really wants to say out loud what might have to be done, because politically it's so difficult. And I wonder, there are lots of benefits to parties changing in a democracy. It doesn't matter who you support or who you'd like to see win. There's benefit to having different parties in power just for the sake and health of being in a democratic society. I've thought to myself, it's really important for us all to understand that big problems in the UK have nothing to do with party politics, nothing to do even with a particular leader, that issues around healthcare and housing and the state pension, these are going to be huge things to tackle and really difficult to tackle regardless of who's in charge.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it comes down to, obviously, ultimately, it lays at the door of politicians and bankers and the people that run the economy. But ultimately, I think voters do play into this to the extent that if someone was to suggest seriously pro-growth policies, for example, if we look at house building or just building in general, if we wanted to do serious deregulation that means we can build and become more productive, there will be hundreds of thousands of people who will object because they're worried about their view, or they're worried about the bats, or they're worried about the newts. And I think until, as a country, we really get behind what's necessary for growth, then we will just continue with this stagnation that people are, as you say, they're not comfortable or happy with, but who knows any different? It's what we've just become accustomed to.
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Yeah, and especially around something like homes and house building, where there is that NIMBY tendency throughout the country to be very worried about the additional homes going up in your own backyard. And a lot of that is the fact that politicians, throughout the decades have refused to listen to communities about what they would actually like in their backyard. For many people, they're very open to the idea of more homes, especially if it means their children and grandchildren can get on the housing ladder. But if they're ugly, then they're not going to like it very much at all. And that top-down approach, which is taken throughout the UK, again, around housing and healthcare, means that a lot doesn't get done.
For me, there's such a missed golden opportunity when a lot of our current problems, and not sound like a broken record in the economy, were started or made worse during the COVID lockdowns. And the COVID lockdowns could have been seen as a time to say, okay, now we can maybe start doing more building projects. We can do things that, maybe this is a bit anti-democratic, but we can do things that there would have been less resistance because of the state we were in. We could have had this post-war attitude and said, right, we've just come through the biggest crisis, for 75 years. We're going to properly rebuild our country, just as we did after the Second World War. But I think, we seem to have missed the boat on that.
It doesn't have to be anti-democratic. You can make the case. And it's very interesting, actually, that you talk about COVID, and we're both at risk of sounding like broken records, so we won't stay on it for too long. However, it's been interesting this week that the debate around the triple lock on the state pension has come up, because of course it was in those early years during COVID where the triple lock was suspended temporarily. It became very clear that pensioners were about to benefit from a huge surge thanks to the triple lock, actually because a lot of young people were losing their jobs at the bottom end of the pay spectrum because of lockdown. So it was going to be a really warped way of dishing out that additional money. And now it's back in the news. You have hints from Labour, you have hints from the Tories that perhaps the triple lock isn't working as it should. That to me is the perfect example of a policy where post-pandemic, there could have been a bipartisan push here where politicians could have said, it turns out this policy we created is not going to work under conditions that we never thought were possible but came up anyway. Let's fix it. But of course, this is very naive of me, because as we've seen this week, even though there does seem to be potentially cross-party consensus that this is something to tackle, they're still shouting at each other that the other's going to ruin the state pension.
Yeah, it's when I saw state pension in the news this week, I didn't even pay it much attention, because I think it's this issue where everyone knows we can't afford it in even the medium term, let alone the long term. I think most people think it's like grossly unfair for the reasons you state. But it's such a popular policy among important core voter groups for both parties that neither of them are ever going to change it. Certainly not now when, as I say, they've missed that sort of bipartisan time that you talk about. They're not going to change it. So I just thought, none of this is serious. We're going to keep the triple lock. It's a shame. It upsets me, but hey.
It's hard to imagine abolish a triple lock being in either of the two parties' biggest manifestos leading into 2029. I agree. We have more graphs from you this week. Thank you, Michael. Check out the Spectator Data Hub to our viewers. If it's not something that you're too familiar with, we have incredible graphs.
It's free.
From Michael and the data team, which include John and Sam. Inflation news was also updated this week. This is supposed to be the best story of the week, really, for the government, that inflation slowed to 2.5% in the 12 months leading up to November. That is slower than people had forecast, and it's pretty much now in line with the Bank of England's forecast that we had at the end of last year. It is expected inflation is going to rise to about 3% by the end of the year and then start falling again. It's above the bank's target, but not by much. The risk here, however, Michael, is that when those employer national insurance hikes come in, the OBR has calculated that those are going to be passed on almost completely to workers' wages in the form of slower pay raises, but also to consumer products. That's a big problem in and of itself. And then also, you've been looking into the numbers and you're skeptical overall.
Yes, so if I can just show a graph that's on the Spectator Data Hub at the moment that's inspired by some work by Pantheon Economics. And this is, to get super technical, this looks at part of the basket of goods that the statisticians from the ONS go around and look at the prices when they're calculating inflation. And one of the key things is airfares. And what this graph shows is airfares based on the date in December that they were collected. And in this month's inflation figures, the date used for long-haul flights was early enough that it meant it was those people who were going travelling and returning before the sort of Christmas price hikes. And so what they've estimated is that if a later date had been chosen in the same month's figures, then it could have made as much as a 14 basis points difference to what inflation actually was. So it suggests that perhaps inflation numbers perhaps actually aren't as good as the ONS suggests.
And would we then see that in the following month's figures in December?
Yes, exactly. So it suggests that we're going to see a rebound next month.
That's very interesting. I think it's a very important reminder that monthly data can only tell us so much. But if we put it all together and if we look at the growth figures out this week, as we just discussed, okay, you had a tiny increase in GDP in November, but if you look at the 3 months leading up to November, there's no growth. And it does start to tell a story of stagnation. It does start to tell a story of inflation being a little more dicey than perhaps people think. But I don't know about you, Michael. I still think borrowing costs are going to be sort of the medium-term biggest headache for this government, because whilst Rachel Reeves has handled the situation, politically speaking, quite well this week, what was also very telling is that the biggest questions that she decided to dodge earlier in the week around the state of the economy and around borrowing costs were the questions asked by her own party about what's going to happen with spending in the future. They kept setting her up to, have a great moment. Isn't it great that the Labour Party hasn't returned to austerity? Isn't it great that we're not opting for spending cuts? And she very bluntly and clearly was just said, I'm going to stick to my fiscal rules. It wasn't like, oh yes, no austerity. It was, no, I'm sticking to my fiscal rules. And it suggests that the spending review coming up this spring is going to be a very painful experience for her party.
Yeah, I think if I was a new Labour MP, I'd be very depressed, because most of these people came into politics at a time where, they define themselves as the anti-Osborne. We're in politics to be anti-austerity. And if the Labour Party is going to push forward with an economic plan that the markets will accept, I don't know about you, but I don't see a way where that doesn't include massive spending cuts. And so people that have come in, define themselves as anti-austerity are going to find that at least the start of their Westminster political careers is going to be about delivering austerity.
I think what's so difficult for this government, and why in so many ways this parliament was always going to be a hospital pass, is you basically have two options with these fiscal rules. You either actually cut money, you cut spending, or you pretend you're going to cut spending, and multiple versions of the Conservative Party opted for the latter, pretending that in 5 years' time on this rolling forecast, there are going to be massive spending cuts. And it does feel like the markets have now seen through that. And Rachel Reeves' own budget, the spending is front-loaded, and the idea is towards the end of the parliament, she's going to become much more austere. Nobody really believed that when the budget was published, but now it's very clear that markets aren't convinced. That means you have to go for that first option and actually implement some spending cuts. And that is where things will get really tricky and interesting.
What a happy time to be alive.
What a great time to be chatting to you, Michael. Thanks for joining Spectator TV.
That's all for this week. We hope you enjoyed the show, and please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your feedback below. Thank you.